Commander G1 walked slowly through the dark corridors of the ancient structure they had discovered deep beneath the surface of Zerion Prime. The walls around him glowed with a strange blue light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. His team had been exploring dead worlds for months, searching for valuable technology to steal or sell. But this place felt different. It felt important. The massive doors to the central chamber had taken 3 days to open. When they finally did, G1's breath caught in his throat. The room stretched far beyond what their lights could reach, filled with towering crystal formations that hummed with ancient power. These weren't just rocks. They were data storage devices older than his entire civilization. Lieutenant Minho stepped up beside him, holding his scanning device with shaking hands. The readings were impossible to believe. "Sir, these energy patterns, they're older than anything we've ever found. This technology is from before the Great Wars, before the Old Empire, before everything we know about galactic history," G1 nodded slowly. The Kethemori had conquered dozens of worlds, always finding primitive species or dead civilizations. They had never encountered anything like this. His people believed they were the strongest race in the galaxy, the most advanced, the most deserving of ruling over others. But standing in this ancient chamber, he felt very small. The translation computers worked for hours to decode the alien language stored in the crystals. When the first words appeared on their screens, the entire team gathered around to read them. The message was simple but terrifying in its directness. "Beware the third world of the Yellow Star," the ancient text warned. "The young ones there must never be provoked. They do not fight like others. They adapt to every challenge. They remember every wrong done to them. They do not forgive those who harm them first." The warning continued with detailed descriptions of a species that seemed almost impossible to believe. These creatures from the Yellow Star system learned from every battle, improved their weapons constantly, and never stopped hunting their enemies. The ancient race called them patient predators, who would follow their prey across the entire galaxy if necessary. Captain Sunho arrived just as they finished reading the warning. He looked at the translated text and burst into loud laughter that echoed through the chamber. "Listen to this nonsense," he said, pointing at the screen. "Some dead alien species was afraid of primitives from a backwater world. They probably got scared by creatures who barely discovered fire." But Jiwon wasn't so sure. The ancient race that built this place had technology far beyond anything the Kethemori possessed. If these beings had been afraid enough to leave detailed warnings, maybe there was a good reason. The crystals contained more than just warnings. They held precise star charts showing the exact location of the Yellow Star system, detailed maps of its planets, and even communication frequencies. Everything needed to find and contact this mysterious species was right there, waiting. Sunho's eyes gleamed with greed as he studied the star charts. "Mark these coordinates in our navigation system," he ordered. "We've found our next target. Imagine the resources a whole system could provide. Imagine the slaves we could take." Jiwon tried to voice his concerns, but Sunho wouldn't listen. The captain had already decided that any species worthy of such warnings must have valuable technology or rich worlds worth conquering. In his mind, the ancient warnings were just proof that these humans would be worth the effort to defeat. As their ships prepared to leave Zerion Prime, G1 took one last look at the glowing crystals. Deep in his gut, he had a terrible feeling that they were making the biggest mistake in Kethemori history. The space around Earth's solar system had been quiet for centuries. Humans went about their daily lives, traveling between planets for work and trade, never expecting that someone might be watching them from the darkness between stars. That peaceful morning changed everything when reality tore open like fabric and massive alien ships poured through the gaps in space. Admiral Hyunwoo stood on the bridge of his flagship, a vessel so large it could swallow entire cities. Around him, hundreds of Kethemori warships spread out like hungry insects, their dark hulls bristling with weapons that could crack planets in half. He felt the familiar rush of excitement that came with finding new prey. His species had done this dance many times before, arrive without warning, take whatever they wanted, and crush anyone who dared to resist. The human worlds looked so defenseless from where he stood. Mars had small mining colonies that would be easy to overrun. Europa's research stations were isolated and vulnerable, and Earth itself, that blue jewel spinning slowly in the distance, would make an excellent addition to the Keth-Mori Empire once its population was properly enslaved. Without bothering to announce their presence, Hyunwoo's mining ships moved toward Mars and Europa, like vultures descending on a fresh kill. Massive drilling machines began tearing into the planet's surfaces, ripping away precious metals and rare minerals that had taken humans decades to locate and extract. The Keth-Mori didn't believe in asking permission or paying for what they took. On Earth, Captain Yuna was having her morning coffee when the emergency alerts started flooding her communication center. The first reports seemed impossible to believe. Unknown ships had appeared throughout the solar system and were actively stealing resources from human colonies. She quickly assembled a small diplomatic fleet, hoping this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could be resolved through peaceful conversation. Her ships approached the alien fleet with their weapons powered down and their communication arrays broadcasting messages of peaceful intent in every language and mathematical formula humans knew. The response came faster than anyone expected and was more brutal than anyone imagined. Beams of pure energy lanced out from the alien vessels, turning the human diplomatic ships into brilliant explosions that lit up the darkness of space. Captain Yuna and her crew vanished in seconds, their final transmission cut short mid-sentence. The aliens had answered humanity's offer of peace with immediate violence. Admiral Hyunwoo's face appeared on every screen, every radio, and every communication device throughout the human solar system. His voice was cold and filled with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. "Primitive creatures of the Third World," he announced, his words carrying across space to reach billions of human ears. "Your species has been selected for conquest. Surrender your world and submit to Keth-Mori rule, or watch everything you love burn in the fires of war." The transmission continued with demands that made every human's blood run cold: complete surrender within one standard day, all military forces to be disbanded immediately, all government leaders to present themselves for execution, the human population to be processed for slavery and relocation to Keth-Mori labor camps throughout the galaxy. Dr. Seungmin was monitoring these transmissions from Lunar Base, humanity's primary research facility on the Moon. As a communications expert, he had spent years studying how different species might try to contact Earth. But he had never imagined first contact would come in the form of an ultimatum backed by overwhelming force. Something about the aliens' casual attitude bothered him deeply. They spoke as if conquering entire civilizations was routine work, like farmers harvesting crops. Their demands were delivered without emotion, suggesting they had made these same threats many times before. But what worried him most was how quickly they had resorted to violence when humans tried to communicate peacefully. As Dr. Seungmin analyzed the alien communication protocols, he began to understand a terrible truth. These invaders had clearly done this before, probably many times. They had a system, a process for conquering other species, but in all their previous victories, they had never encountered anything like what was about to wake up in response to their threats. Across the solar system, defense networks that had been sleeping quietly in asteroid fields and hidden moon bases began receiving activation codes that hadn't been used in generations. Humanity was about to show these confident invaders why the ancient warnings had been written. The Keth-Mori had made their biggest mistake by assuming humans were just another primitive species waiting to be conquered. What they saw as a few scattered colonies and research stations was actually an elaborate disguise that had been maintained for over 200 years. Humanity had learned long ago that the galaxy was full of predators, and the best way to survive was to look harmless while building the biggest stick possible. Deep in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, chunks of rock that had drifted peacefully for decades suddenly began to crack open like giant eggs. What emerged from inside weren't mining operations or research facilities, but massive shipyards that had been hidden from any scanning technology the aliens possessed. These weren't recent constructions either. Some of these facilities had been building warships in secret for 3 generations. Lieutenant Commander Yunji had spent her entire career preparing for this exact moment. From her command center buried deep inside Ceres Station, she watched as tactical displays lit up with thousands of contacts that had been invisible just hours before. Her fingers moved across control panels with practiced precision, sending activation codes to defense networks that stretched from Mercury to the edge of the solar system. "All stations, this is Ceres Command," she announced over encrypted channels that the aliens couldn't detect. "Execute Protocol 7, authorization code Omega Black. Show these invaders what happens when you threaten humanity." Protocol 7 was humanity's ultimate contingency plan, developed after decades of studying other galactic civilizations and their military tactics. Every human child learned in school that their species had enemies among the stars, even if they had never met them. Every adult knew that someday someone would come to take their worlds by force. Today was that someday. From his research station on Titan, Professor Dongwu had been studying the alien fleet since their arrival. His job was to find weaknesses, and what he discovered made him almost feel sorry for the invaders. The Kethmori fought exactly like every other successful predator species, with overwhelming numbers and superior firepower. They were used to enemies who either surrendered immediately or fought back with primitive weapons and predictable tactics. "They're going to be in for quite a shock," he muttered to himself as he analyzed their formation patterns. The aliens had arranged their ships in a classic domination display, designed to intimidate their enemies into submission. But intimidation only worked against species who hadn't spent centuries preparing for exactly this type of encounter. Beyond Neptune's orbit, construction facilities that had been disguised as research stations began revealing their true purpose. These weren't places where humans studied the outer planets. They were military shipyards, where the most advanced warships in human history had been built in complete secrecy. Ships that used technology the Kethmori had never encountered, powered by energy sources that didn't show up on standard scans. Captain Taehyun received his orders while his fleet was still hidden in the shadow of a large asteroid. His ships were unlike anything the aliens had seen during their initial survey of the solar system. Stealth technology that made them nearly invisible, weapons that could punch through shields the Kethmori thought were impenetrable, and most importantly, crews who had trained their entire lives for this exact battle. "All ships prepare for emergence," he commanded over secure channels. "Remember, they started this fight by murdering our diplomats. We're going to finish it by showing them why that was the worst mistake they ever made." The transformation of humanity's appearance happened faster than the Kethmori could process. One moment they were facing a handful of helpless colonies scattered across a primitive solar system. The next moment, they were surrounded by a military force that had been planning for their arrival since before most of their crews were born. What the aliens had thought was a simple conquest was about to become the fight of their lives. They had awakened something that had been sleeping quietly in the darkness, pretending to be weak, while growing stronger with each passing year. The Kethmori were about to learn why the ancient warnings had spoken of humans with such fear and respect. The hunters had become the hunted, and they didn't even know it yet. The battle began in a way that shattered everything the Kethmori thought they knew about warfare. One moment their massive fleet was floating confidently in space, preparing to begin the systematic destruction of human colonies. The next moment, ships were appearing out of nowhere like deadly magic tricks, striking with surgical precision before vanishing back into the void. Commander Nari had spent 15 years perfecting stealth technology that the aliens couldn't even detect, let alone counter. Her frigates were built to be invisible hunters, designed specifically to take apart larger fleets piece by piece. As she watched her tactical display show the alien formation, she felt like a wolf studying a flock. "Thove sheep, remember the plan," she told her strike teams over encrypted channels. "These invaders think they're unstoppable because they've never faced an enemy who could hide from them. We're going to teach them what real fear feels like." Her ships moved through space like shadows given form, their stealth systems making them completely invisible to Kethmori sensors. The aliens had built their entire military strategy around the idea that bigger ships with bigger guns always won battles. They had never encountered an enemy who preferred to strike from the darkness and disappear before anyone could strike back. The first targets were the alien communication satellites that connected their fleet. Without warning, these vital systems simply exploded in brilliant flashes of light, leaving the Kethmori ships unable to coordinate with each other. Admiral Hyunwoo found himself screaming orders that his fleet couldn't hear, watching his carefully planned formation fall apart as confusion spread through his ranks. "What's happening?" he demanded from his bridge, but his communication officers could only shake their heads in bewilderment. Their sensors showed nothing but empty space, yet their ships were being destroyed one by an enemy they couldn't see or track. The Kethmori had built their warships to intimidate through sheer size and overwhelming firepower. These massive vessels were designed to make other species surrender just by looking at them. But all that size and armor became a liability when fighting an enemy who specialized in finding weak points and exploiting them with devastating efficiency. Captain Jae-hoon led the most dangerous part of the human strategy, boarding operations against active enemy ships. His teams used small fast craft that could dock with alien vessels before their crews even knew they were under attack. Once inside, the humans moved through the ships like trained assassinates, but their mission wasn't to kill everyone aboard. Download everything, Jae-hoon ordered his technical specialists as they secured another alien bridge. Every database, every tactical manual, every piece of information about how these ships work. Then plant the electromagnetic pulse devices and get out. The boarding teams were learning something new about their enemies with every ship they infiltrated. The Kethmori were incredibly advanced in some ways, but they had never developed countermeasures against the kind of asymmetric warfare humans specialized in. Their ships had powerful shields against energy weapons, but no defense against small teams of soldiers who could appear inside their hulls. Every engagement taught humanity more about Kethmori weaknesses while teaching the aliens nothing useful about human capabilities. The invaders found themselves fighting ghosts who struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. Their massive guns were useless against enemies they couldn't see, and their thick armor meant nothing against explosives planted inside their own ships. For the first time in their long history of conquest, the Kethmori experienced what it felt like to be hunted by a superior predator. Their fleet, which had terrorized dozens of worlds, began falling apart as individual ships either exploded mysteriously or simply went dark, their crews unconscious from electromagnetic pulse attacks. Admiral Hyunwoo realized with growing horror that his species had made a terrible mistake. These weren't primitive creatures who could be intimidated into submission. These were apex predators who had been waiting patiently for someone to threaten them, and now they were demonstrating exactly why the ancient warnings had been written. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were learning that humans were very, very good at this game. While the physical battle raged in space, another war was being fought in the digital realm that the Kethmori never saw coming. Specialist Minji sat in her underground bunker on Earth, surrounded by quantum computers that hummed with barely contained power. Her job was to turn the aliens' greatest strength, their interconnected fleet network, into their most devastating weakness. The Kethmori had built their entire military around the idea of perfect communication between ships. Every vessel in their fleet was connected through quantum channels that allowed instant coordination across vast distances. This network had helped them conquer dozens of worlds by ensuring their attacks were always perfectly synchronized. But they had never encountered an enemy who could turn that same network against them. Minji's fingers danced across holographic keyboards as she probed the alien communication system, looking for ways inside. The Kethmori had excellent security against direct attacks, but they had never imagined someone might try to infiltrate their network by pretending to be one of their own ships. Using data stolen from captured vessels, she created a digital ghost that appeared to be a legitimate part of their fleet. Once inside their network, Minji began her psychological warfare campaign. The alien crews suddenly found their personal communication devices flooding with videos they had never seen before. Footage of human boarding teams moving through Kethmori ships like trained professionals, systematically disabling systems and capturing crew members without unnecessary violence. Images of human stealth ships appearing out of nowhere, to destroy alien vessels with surgical precision. But what disturbed the Kethmori most wasn't the effectiveness of human attacks. It was the attitude of the attackers themselves. The aliens had expected their enemies to fight with rage and desperation, the way most conquered species behaved. Instead, they watched humans work with the calm efficiency of people doing a job they had trained for their entire lives. Look at their faces, one Kethmori communications officer whispered to his captain as they watched footage of human soldiers securing an alien bridge. They're not angry. They're not afraid. They're just working. This realization spread through the alien fleet like a virus. The Kethmori had built their reputation on being the apex predators of the galaxy, the species that other races feared above all others. But watching these videos, they began to understand that they had encountered something even more dangerous, a species that treated warfare like a science rather than an emotional response to threat. The psychological impact was devastating. Alien crews who had conquered worlds without breaking a sweat now found themselves jumping at shadows, wondering if human boarding teams were already inside their ships. Every unexplained sound, every minor system malfunction became a source of terror as they imagined invisible enemies moving through their corridors. Major Seokjin's intelligence division had been busy during the battle, using captured navigation data to trace the aliens' hyperspace routes back to their origins. While the Kethmori fleet was dealing with stealth attacks and psychological warfare, human computers were mapping their entire territory, identifying their homeworlds, military, bases and supply lines. Admiral Hyunwoo finally gave the order his species had never had to give before: retreat. The mighty Kethmori fleet, which had arrived expecting easy conquest, began fleeing back toward their home territory, with human forces following at a careful distance. But the aliens didn't realize they were making their situation even worse by leading their enemies directly to everything they wanted to protect. The human fleet followed like patient wolves, tracking wounded prey, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection while maintaining constant surveillance. They had learned everything they needed to know about Kethmori military capabilities, and now they were going to see what the aliens' homeworlds looked like when the defenders became the attackers. The Kethmori thought they were escaping to safety, but they were actually providing their enemies with a guided tour of every target worth hitting. The hunters had not only become the hunted, they were leading their predators straight home to finish the job they had started. What had begun as an invasion was rapidly becoming an extinction-level event for the Kethmori Empire, and they still didn't fully understand what they had awakened by threatening humanity's peaceful worlds. The Kethmori had fled across the galaxy thinking they were escaping to safety, but they had actually led their worst nightmare straight to their doorstep. When human fleets emerged from hyperspace in 3 different star systems at exactly the same moment, the aliens realized with growing horror that their enemies had been planning this coordinated strike for months while pretending to simply chase stragglers. The technology that appeared with the human ships was unlike anything the Kethmori had encountered before, even during their initial invasion of Earth. These weren't the same vessels that had fought them in the Sol system. These were new ships, built using captured Kethmori technology that had been studied, improved, and turned into weapons far more effective than the originals. The aliens watched in disbelief as human ships used their own hyperspace technology to jump directly inside their defensive perimeters, bypassing shield generators and orbital platforms that had protected their worlds for centuries. The humans hadn't just copied Kethmori technology, they had made it better, faster, and more precise than anything the original designers had imagined possible. Colonel Haon stood on the bridge of her command ship as it entered the atmosphere of Kethmor Prime, the capital world of an empire that had terrorized dozens of species. Her mission was unlike anything in the history of warfare, to demonstrate humanity's military superiority, while showing they were nothing like the monsters who had attacked Earth without provocation. "All units, remember your orders," she announced to her ground forces as they prepared for deployment. "Military targets only. Any soldier who harms a civilian will answer to me personally. We're here to end a war, not start a genocide." The human assault on Kethmor Prime was a masterpiece of military precision that left the alien defenders confused and terrified. Instead of the brutal planetary bombardment they expected, human forces used surgical strikes to disable military installations while leaving civilian areas completely untouched. Power plants that supplied military bases were destroyed, but hospitals and schools continued to receive electricity through rerouted systems. Kethmori military commanders found their communication centers, weapons factories, and spaceports systematically eliminated by human forces who seemed to know exactly where everything was located. But when they looked toward their cities, they saw something that broke their understanding of warfare: human soldiers directing civilian evacuations away from military targets, ensuring that non-combatants weren't caught in the crossfire. Munfbai. Message Colonel Heian broadcast to the alien leadership was heard across all three invaded systems simultaneously, translated into every Kethmori dialect and transmitted on frequencies their entire population could receive. Her words were calm and professional, but carried a threat that made even their most hardened military leaders feel afraid. "People of the Kethmori Empire," she began, her image appearing on screens throughout their territory. "Your military forces attacked our worlds without warning and murdered our diplomats who came in peace. We are here to ensure this never happens again. We don't want to be conquerors like you, but we will become whatever we need to be to protect our people." The civilian populations of the Kethmori worlds watched in amazement as human soldiers helped evacuate their neighborhoods before destroying nearby military facilities. These weren't the savage destroyers their leaders had told them to expect. These were disciplined professionals who seemed more concerned with avoiding civilian casualties than with inflicting maximum damage. This careful restraint somehow made the humans more terrifying than any brutal conqueror could have been. The Kethmori began to understand that they were dealing with a species that could destroy their entire civilization whenever they chose to, but were choosing not to, because they had moral principles that prevented unnecessary killing. The aliens realized they were facing apex predators who followed rules of engagement, even while demonstrating their overwhelming superiority. This combination of devastating military capability and ethical restraint was something the Kethmori had never encountered before, and it shattered their understanding of how conquest was supposed to work. As their military infrastructure crumbled around them and their civilian populations remained mysteriously safe, the Kethmori leadership began to grasp the terrible magnitude of their mistake. They had awakened something far more dangerous than a simple military opponent. They had provoked a species that could be merciful while being unstoppable. The ancient archives on Zerion Prime had become the Kethmori's last hope for understanding the nightmare they had unleashed upon themselves. As their empire crumbled under precise human attacks across 3 star systems, desperate alien leaders returned to the dead world where this catastrophe had begun, searching frantically for any information that might help them survive what they had started. Archaeologist Jisoo worked around the clock in the glowing crystal chambers, her hands shaking as she accessed deeper and deeper levels of the precursor archives. The warning they had found before was just the beginning. There were thousands of data cores buried in the ancient structure, each containing fragments of a story that would change everything the galaxy thought it knew about human history. The Bo. First shocking discovery came when she accessed the precursor historical records. These weren't just warnings left by a dead civilization. They were the final testament of a species that had once ruled half the galaxy before being systematically driven from their territory by an enemy they had greatly underestimated. "Commander." "Hwanho, you need to see this immediately," Jisoo called out, her voice filled with terror as she read the translated text appearing on her screens. The data cores contained detailed records of first contact between the precursors and humanity, and the slow-motion disaster that followed. The precursors had been much like the Kethmori, a powerful, technologically advanced species that expanded through conquest and considered themselves the rightful rulers of any territory they could claim. When they first encountered humans thousands of years ago, they saw primitive creatures living on a few scattered worlds, perfect targets for easy expansion. But the archived records told a very different story than anyone expected. The humans the precursors had attacked weren't primitive at all. They were the advanced scouts of a civilization that had been carefully exploring the galaxy for millennia, deliberately appearing weak while studying every species they encountered. "Read this section aloud," Commander Wonho ordered, pointing at text that made his blood run cold. The final entries in the precursor archives described a war that lasted for centuries, not because the humans were weak, but because they were patient. They had learned everything about precursor technology, society, and military tactics before revealing their true capabilities. Jisoo's voice cracked as she read the ancient warnings. "The young ones from the yellow star do not fight like other species. They remember every battle, learn from every defeat, and never stop growing stronger. We believed we could contain them to their small territory. We thought our superior numbers and advanced weapons would ensure victory. We were catastrophically wrong. The archives revealed that humanity had been expanding slowly and carefully across the galaxy for thousands of years, always appearing less advanced than they actually were, always letting other species believe they were isolated and primitive. Each encounter with hostile aliens taught them new lessons about galactic warfare and technology. The precursors had made the same mistake as the Kethmori. They had attacked human colonies expecting easy conquest, only to discover they had awakened something that viewed warfare as a science to be perfected. The humans hadn't just defended themselves. They had systematically dismantled the precursor empire piece by piece, forcing the survivors to flee beyond the galactic rim. Commander Wonho realized with growing horror that the Kethmori invasion of Earth wasn't humanity's first encounter with galactic predators. It was just the latest test of defenses that had been refined over millennia of conflict. Every species that had ever threatened human territory had unknowingly contributed to making humanity more dangerous. The final data core contained the most terrifying revelation of all. The precursors hadn't gone extinct. They had fled to the empty space between galaxies, living in exile while watching their former territory slowly fill with human colonies that appeared primitive and defenseless to anyone who didn't know better. "They're still out there," Jisoo whispered as she read the final entries. "The precursors are still alive, hiding in the void between galaxies, too afraid to ever return because they know the humans will be waiting for them." The Kethmori hadn't discovered an easy target for conquest. They had stumbled upon the galaxy's apex predators, who had been patiently waiting for the next challenger to reveal themselves. Now they understood why the ancient warnings had been so desperate and detailed, because species that threatened humanity didn't just lose battles, they lost everything. The chase had taken humanity to places no human had ever been before. Captain. So-young stood on the bridge of her exploration vessel, staring out at the vast emptiness that stretched between galaxies. Behind her, the Milky Way looked like a distant spiral of stars, while ahead lay nothing but the cold darkness of intergalactic space. But her senses were picking up something that shouldn't exist in this cosmic wasteland. The fleeing Kethmori had thought they were clever, using their most advanced stealth technology to hide their escape route. They had fled to the very edge of the galaxy, beyond where any reasonable pursuit would follow. But they hadn't counted on human determination, or the fact that their enemies had been quietly studying their technology for months. "Captain, we're detecting quantum signatures consistent with Kethmori hyperspace drives," reported Lieutenant Kyungmin from the sensor station. "The trail leads directly into the galactic halo, approximately 40,000 light-years from the galactic edge." So-young nodded grimly. The galactic halo was a region of space where only the oldest and most desperate civilizations tried to hide. It was a place of ancient debris, rogue planets, and forgotten relics from the galaxy's violent past. The perfect place for a dying empire to make its final stand. But what the Kethmori didn't know was that humanity had spent the past several months doing more than just chasing their fleets. Human engineers had been reverse engineering every piece of alien technology they could capture, not just copying it, but improving it in ways the original designers never imagined possible. The quantum drives that powered Kethmori ships were impressive, but human scientists had found ways to make them more efficient and precise. The stealth systems that helped aliens hide from their enemies were good, but humans had developed countermeasures that could track them across impossible distances. Every advantage the Kethmori thought they possessed had been turned against them. "Sir, long-range scans are showing massive artificial structures ahead," called out the navigation officer. "It looks like they've built some kind of fortress world, out there in the void." Through the view screen, Soo-young could see their destination taking shape. The Kethmori had found a rogue planet, drifting in the empty space between galaxies, and turned it into their ultimate stronghold. Massive defensive stations surrounded the world like a metal shell, bristling with weapons that could destroy entire fleets. It was an impressive sight that would have discouraged most attackers, but Captain Soo-young had been studying Kethmori defensive strategies for months. She knew their patterns, their weaknesses, and most importantly, she knew they were still thinking like conquerors instead of survivors. They had built their fortress to intimidate enemies who might approach from predictable directions, not to defend against hunters who had learned to think like they did. "Prep the new drive systems," she ordered her crew, "and make sure the stealth generators are running at full capacity. We're going to show these aliens what happens when you try to hide from humanity." The human ships that approached the Kethmori fortress were unlike anything that had participated in the original battle at Earth. These vessels incorporated months of technological advancement based on captured alien designs, but improved with human ingenuity and determination. They could jump through hyperspace with precision the Kethmori had never achieved, remain invisible to sensors that should have detected them, and strike with weapons that used the aliens' own technology against them. The final Kethmori leaders watched their sensor displays in growing despair as impossible contacts began appearing throughout their defensive perimeter. Human ships were emerging from hyperspace inside their supposedly impregnable fortress, using improved versions of their own technology to bypass defenses that had taken years to construct. "How are they doing this?" screamed the alien commander, watching his outer defensive ring collapse under surgical strikes from an enemy that shouldn't have been able to reach this far into the void. "We used our most advanced stealth systems to hide our escape route." But it was too late for questions or regrets. The hunters had followed their prey to the very edge of the galaxy, and there would be no escape this time. The Kethmori had thought they could hide in the darkness between stars, but they had underestimated humanity's determination to finish what they had started. The final battle was about to begin in the coldest, loneliest place in the universe, and the outcome was already decided. The final battle at the edge of the galaxy lasted only 6 hours, but it changed the balance of power in the universe forever. Admiral Kyung-soo watched from his flagship as the last Kethmori defensive stations fell silent, their weapons systems disabled by human boarding teams who had infiltrated the fortress using the aliens' own technology against them. What had begun as humanity's desperate defense of Earth had transformed into something far more significant: the emergence of a new apex predator that would reshape how every species in the galaxy thought about warfare and conquest. The humans who had once seemed like easy prey had proven they were actually the most dangerous hunters the galaxy had ever seen. The Kethmori fortress world, which had been designed to withstand sieges lasting decades, crumbled under human assault, tactics that the aliens couldn't comprehend or counter. Every defensive measure they had developed over centuries of conquest became useless against an enemy that had spent months studying their technology and finding ways to turn it into a weapon. Admiral Kyung-soo received the alien surrender transmission while standing in what had once been the Kethmori command center. The alien leaders who had been so confident when they invaded Earth now begged for mercy, with voices filled with terror and desperation. But humanity had learned important lessons about galactic politics during this conflict. "Your species came to our worlds without warning," the Admiral stated calmly to the assembled Kethmori leadership, his words being broadcast across their communication network so every survivor could hear. "You murdered our diplomats who came in peace. You threatened to enslave our people and steal our resources. These actions have consequences that your species will live with forever." The terms of surrender were harsh but not genocidal, reflecting humanity's evolution from naive newcomers to experienced galactic powers. The surviving Kethmori would be allowed to live, but they would never again pose a threat to any other species. Their military technology would be confiscated, their warships destroyed, and their people relocated to ships that would carry them beyond the galactic barrier into permanent exile. You will serve as a living warning, Admiral Kyung-soo continued, to any other species that might consider attacking humanity or our allies. Your fate will be broadcast across known space so that everyone understands what happens to unprovoked aggressors. The Kethmori Fortress world was converted into something the galaxy had never seen before, a monitoring station that would broadcast the story of the aliens' defeat to every civilized world within 100 light-years. The message was simple but powerful. Humanity had tried to make peaceful contact, been attacked without cause, and responded by systematically dismantling an empire that had terrorized dozens of species. As human fleets began their journey home, they left behind a network of early warning systems and defense platforms that would ensure no other aggressive species could surprise them the way the Kethmori had tried to do. The solar system that had once seemed isolated and vulnerable was now the center of an expanding sphere of human influence. Other galactic civilizations received the broadcasts from the monitoring station with a mixture of fear and relief. Species that had been terrorized by Kethmori expansion were grateful to see their oppressors defeated, but they also realized that a new power had emerged that might be even more formidable than the empire it had replaced. The ancient warnings found in the precursor archives had proven prophetic. Humanity had indeed been the sleeping giant that other species should never have awakened. The Kethmori had learned too late that humans didn't just defend themselves when threatened, they hunted their enemies to the very edge of existence and beyond. As human ships returned to their expanding territory, carrying with them the technology and knowledge gained from their first galactic war, every intelligent species in the galaxy understood that the balance of power had permanently shifted. The naive, peaceful civilization that had once offered diplomatic contact had been replaced by apex predators who ruled through demonstrated strength and unwavering determination. The elders' warnings had been ignored, and now their hunters ruled. The stars with the quiet confidence of predators who had proven they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy.